The chains around my wrists were not made for human bones, and every step down that metal corridor felt like the last one I would ever take. My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 days ago I was the only survivor pulled out of a wrecked transport ship near a border nobody bothered to patrol. Now I was being marched into Kharnex Deep, a prison built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, where the galaxy sent the things it wanted to forget. 2 guards walked beside me, their skin the color of wet stone, their eyes narrow and unreadable. One of them looked me over like I was a joke someone had played on him. "This is the human," he said to the other, his voice flat with disbelief. "This is what they are so afraid of." The other guard laughed, a dry rattling sound. "He will not last the week." I did not answer. I had learned quickly that words meant nothing here unless you had something to back them up, and right now, chained and unarmed, I had nothing. So I kept walking, kept my head level, and studied everything I could see. The wide doors, the vents overhead, the way the guards carried their weapons a little too loosely, like they had never once needed to use them against someone who refused to break. They pushed me into a massive chamber carved from black rock, lit by pale strips of light that buzzed faintly above rows of cells stacked 5 levels high. The air smelled of metal and something bitter I could not name. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me as the guards shoved me through the gate. Every kind of creature imaginable stood in that yard, some taller than the doorway, some with skin like armor, some with too many limbs to count. And in the middle of it all, one voice rose above the rest. "A human," it said, amused. "I did not know they still made such small things." The voice belonged to a towering creature named Korath, broad-shouldered, with ridges running down his arms like plaited bark. He was the closest thing this block had to a ruler, and everyone around him moved out of his way without being told twice. I said nothing. I let the guards remove my chains and walked toward an empty corner of the yard, ignoring the laughter that followed me. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone mutter a number, followed by more laughter. They were betting on how many days I had left. I found a spot against the wall and sat down, watching. That was the first thing I decided to do in that place before anything else. Watch, learn, wait. The first night nobody touched me. I think they wanted to see what I would do first, whether I would cry or beg or try to run. I did none of those things. I studied the guard rotations. I noted which corners of the yard the cameras did not reach. I watched how the different groups moved, who avoided who nodded at who. In a place built to break people down to nothing, information was the only weapon I had, and I intended to use it. By the second day, word had already spread that the human had not made a sound, had not begged, had not shown fear. To them, this was strange. Most species reacted to captivity with noise, either violence or despair. My silence unsettled them more than anything I could have said. That was when Korath decided to test me. He crossed the yard with 3 of his men flanking him, and the crowd parted like water around a stone. I stood up slowly, keeping my hands loose at my sides, my heart hammering in my chest even though my face stayed still. "You have not spoken since you arrived," Korath said, towering over me. "Are you broken already, small creature, or simply foolish?" "Neither," I said. It was the first word I had spoken since the transport ship. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Korath tilted his head, studying me the way a predator studies something it has not decided is worth eating yet. "Then perhaps you would like to prove it." I knew what was coming before he finished the sentence. In a place like this, reputation was currency, and Korath needed to remind everyone who owned this yard. I was simply the easiest way to do that. I will not describe what happened in detail, only that it was not a fair contest, and it was never meant to be won. Korath was faster and stronger, built for exactly this kind of test. But I had spent 2 days learning the shape of this yard, the angles, the loose gravel near the wall, the exact spot where the light overhead flickered and dimmed for half a second every few moments. I used all of it. I did not fight to win in the way Korath expected. I fought to survive the next 30 seconds, and then the 30 after that, refusing to fall no matter how many times I was knocked down. Every time I hit the ground, I got back up. Not because I was strong enough to win, but because staying down had never once occurred to me as an option. By the end, I was bruised and out of breath, and Korath was standing over me, clearly able to finish things if he chose to. But he did not. He looked down at me with something new in his expression, something between confusion and respect. "You should not still be standing," he said quietly. "Then I suppose I am full of surprises," I answered, and pulled myself back to my feet one more time. The yard had gone completely silent. Nobody placed bets after that. Nobody laughed. Word of what happened spread through Kharnex Deep faster than any guard announcement ever could. By the end of the week, inmates from other blocks were finding excuses to walk past our yard just to see the human who would not stay down. I did not think of myself as anything special. I had simply refused to quit, the same way I imagine anyone from Earth would have in that position. But here, in a place built on strength and fear, refusing to quit apparently meant something. I used that reputation carefully. I did not try to become a leader, because leadership in a place like this was usually a target painted on your back. Instead, I became something quieter, useful. I noticed early on that the different groups in the prison rarely spoke to each other, let alone worked together. Every species stayed with its own kind, trading only when necessary, fighting over scraps of food or better cell placement. It was a system built entirely on mistrust, and the guards liked it that way. A divided yard was an easy yard to control. So I started small. I traded information for food, teaching a group of smaller inmates, creatures called the Vethi, simple techniques for defending themselves without relying on size or strength alone. Balance, leverage, timing. Things that did not require claws or armor plating, just patience and practice. In exchange, they shared their knowledge of the tunnels beneath the lower levels, passages the guards did not fully map. Then I did the same for another group, then another. I never asked for loyalty. I only asked that they listen, and that if they learned something useful, they pass it along to someone else who needed it. Slowly. Without anyone quite noticing how it happened, different corners of Kharnex Deep, that had never spoken to each other before, started trading skills, food, and information freely. Korath watched all of this with a kind of quiet curiosity. One evening, he sat down across from me in the yard, the first time he had approached me since our first encounter. "You are building something," he said. It was not an accusation. It sounded more like genuine interest. "I am surviving," I said. "This just happens to be how I do it." "Your kind is strange," Korath admitted. "Where I come from, weakness is punished. Kindness is the same as weakness." "Where I come from," I said, "kindness is what keeps people alive when strength runs out. And strength always runs out eventually." He did not answer right away. But after that conversation, Korath stopped testing me and started, in his own quiet way, protecting the work I was doing. He never said it outright. He simply made sure nobody interfered. Months passed. I will not pretend every day was easy. There were nights I lay awake in my cell, missing the sky, missing simple things like rain or the sound of a real ocean. There were setbacks too. A guard named Grant, cold and precise, took a particular interest in undermining what I was building. He separated groups I had connected, moved certain inmates to different blocks just to break apart the trust we had formed. Each time, I found another way to rebuild it. Every setback taught me something the first attempt had missed. The administration noticed, of course. A prison depends on division to keep control, and here was a human quietly stitching the population back together. I was called into a private room one day, no guards flanking me this time, just a warden named Counselor Drass sitting behind a desk, studying me with narrow, calculating eyes. "You understand what you are doing," Drass said. It was not a question. "I am keeping people from dying over food scraps," I said. "That is all. You are making my job difficult." Your job is to guard prisoners. It should not require them to hate each other. Drass leaned back, considering me for a long moment. There will come a time, he said finally, when I test what you have built, and I will enjoy watching it fall apart. I did not respond. I simply stood, waiting to be dismissed, and walked back into the yard where Korath and a dozen others were waiting to hear what had happened. When I told them, nobody looked afraid. They looked, for the first time since I had arrived, united. The test came 3 weeks later, and it came in the worst possible way. The administration announced a new event, something they called the Proving Grounds, a controlled section of the prison where selected inmates would be placed against genetically enhanced champions bred specifically to keep prisoners in line through fear. It was framed as entertainment for the guards, but everyone understood the real purpose. They wanted to remind us who was truly in control, and they wanted to do it by breaking whatever I had built, piece by piece, in front of everyone. They chose me first. I was led into a wide arena carved from the same black rock as the rest of the prison, walls too high to climb, a crowd of guards watching from an elevated platform above. Across from me stood something they called a dreith, a massive engineered creature built for exactly one purpose. It was not cruelty that had built it. It was design, precise and cold, meant to prove a single point. I remember standing there, alone, staring across the arena floor, and thinking that this was likely the moment the story of the strange human ended. Then I heard something I did not expect. Voices chanting from beyond the arena walls. Not guards, inmates. Word had spread through the tunnels the Vetha had shown me, through channels built over months of quiet trust, and somehow, impossibly, the entire block had found a way to watch. My name, or the closest thing they could pronounce of it, echoed off the stone walls. I will not describe every moment of what followed, only that it was long and difficult, and there were points where I did not believe I would still be standing at the end of it. But I remembered every lesson those months had taught me. I remembered the loose gravel, the flickering lights, the value of patience over strength. I remembered that the dreith, for all its power, had never once been taught to think its way through a fight, only to overwhelm. So I did not meet it with strength. I met it with everything else I had learned, every trick, every piece of knowledge traded in that yard over the past year, until finally, exhausted and barely able to stand, I was still the only one left standing on that arena floor. The silence afterward was heavier than any noise could have been. Counselor Drass stood on that platform, staring down at me with an expression I could not read, and for the first time since I had arrived at Kharnex Deep, I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. He never tried to break what I had built again after that day, not because he respected it, I think, but because he understood, finally, that it could not be broken with force alone. The prison had changed, quietly and completely, and there was no test left that could undo it. Years passed after that. I will not claim I became some kind of ruler, because that was never the point, and I think if I had tried, it would have destroyed everything I had spent so long building. Instead, I became something simpler, a voice people listened to, a reminder that even in a place built to strip away everything good in a person, there were still choices to be made, still ways to hold onto something worth holding onto. New inmates arrived over the years, brought in chains through the same corridors I had once walked, expecting nothing but fear and isolation. Instead, they found a yard that worked together, groups that shared instead of hoarded, guards who had quietly stopped enforcing certain rules because enforcing them was no longer worth the trouble. I remember one particular arrival, a small nervous creature named Leela Van, human like me, the second I had ever seen in this place. She looked terrified, the same way I imagine I had looked on my first day, though I doubt anyone would have described me that way at the time. They told me a story on the way in, she said quietly, sitting beside me in the yard that first night, about a human who came here alone and never gave up. I did not believe it until now. It is not really about giving up or not, I told her. It is about deciding every single day that tomorrow is worth showing up for. That is all it ever was. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, and I could see something settle in her, the same quiet resolve I remembered finding in myself all those years ago. I do not know how much longer I will be here. Sentences in a place like this are rarely fixed, and freedom is a distant, uncertain thing. But I no longer measure my time here in days survived. I measure it in the people who no longer fight over scraps, in the tunnels that connect instead of divide, in the quiet nods I get from guards who once expected to bury me within the week. They thought I would not survive this place. Instead, without ever intending to, I became something this place had never seen before. Not a warden, not a ruler, just a reminder carried from cell to cell, block to block, that even in the darkest corner of the galaxy, kindness and patience could outlast fear every single time. And if there is one thing I have learned since the day those chains were locked around my wrists, it is this. Strength can build a prison, but it cannot hold together the people inside it. Only something else can do that. Something smaller, quieter, and far more stubborn than strength could ever hope to be. That, I think, is the only legend worth leaving behind.